In this section, we are going to be doing my favorite, one of my favorites, and that's solving quadratic equations. Actually, I love solving equations, and quadratics are great. Sort of my favorite are log equations or trig equations, but quadratics are good too. Okay, so far in this chapter, we've been looking at mostly quadratic expressions like this one, and we've learned how to factor that, and we've done ones where there's a number out front, and our main thing though has been working with expressions like this. And typically with the expressions, we either factor them like that, or we'll multiply and simplify them. All of those skills are important for us because the purpose to get good at doing that stuff is so you can solve equations. So this here is an equation, that one there's an expression. With an expression you can rewrite it, but there's no x equals something. Like that's not something that you think about when you're looking at an expression. But if you have an equation, that's what you are wanting. I want to know x is equal to something. Now, in normal equations, like this linear equation, we can use a lot of different tools that we've seen before. One of them was a subtraction principle, so I'll subtract 5 on both sides, and then I'll use the division principle, divide both sides by 2, by 3 I mean. Whoops, that should be a 3. I was getting my answer already. Divide both sides by 3 and I come up with x is equal to 2. And then I can always take and plug that 2 back in and just see if my answer is true. 3 times 2 is 6. 6 plus 5 is equal to 11. But we had a subtraction principle. We had a division principle. But how do you then go and solve a quadratic equation? There's got to be some other kind of thing that we do or another rule that we need to add to our toolbox. So anytime you have a quadratic equation, it looks like this, similar to this, where you have a something x squared, something times an x, something times c. Any of these things could be 0 except for a. Like you always have to have a x squared term in there to make it a quadratic. Because you have an x squared term, all quadratic equations also result in 2 solutions. Sometimes they're the same number, sometimes they're not real solutions but maybe complex solutions, but you're always coming up with 2 solutions out of them. So let's look at what this principle is that we need to use in order to solve this. So right now, like you could move 6 to the other side. That's what we typically do. We put x's on one side and numbers on the other side. But when we're solving quadratic equations, we don't want to do that. I guess we could guess. We could plug a number like 4 in. 4 squared is 16 minus 5 times 4 is a negative 20 plus 6. Yeah, that's not going to be a 0. I could try another number. But rather than guessing, we've got a tool that helps us do it. And the tool is called the zero property. And the zero property says that if you have 2 things that multiply together and they give you 0, then one of those 2 things has to be equal to 0. Either a p is 0 or a q is 0. For example, if I have x times y is equal to 0, then either x is 0 or y is equal to 0. So I'm going to use that property to help me solve a quadratic equation. For example, this one. I've got something multiplied, there's a times in there, right? Something times something is equal to 0. Well, one of those 2 things has to be equal to 0. So either x minus 3 is equal to 0, or x plus 4 is equal to 0. Well, these now are linear equations that I can solve. I can add 3 to both sides, so I get 3 on this one. I can subtract 4 on both sides, and I get a negative 4 there. Notice that these are my 2 solutions to this equation. It's a quadratic because x times x would give me an x squared, but I have 2 solutions to that equation. I could plug either one in. 3 take away 3 is 0. 0 times, it doesn't matter what it is, comes out to 0. That works. I could plug a negative 4 in right there. Negative 4 plus 4 is 0. 0 times anything is still 0. So both of those answers are correct. All right, let's take a look at this one. I've got, y something times something equals 0. Zero property says that either y is 0 or 3y minus 17 is 0. So y is 0, that's one of my answers, and then I have to solve this. 3y, I'll add 17 to both sides, and then I'll divide both sides by 3, and 17/3 is my other answer. So either this or that are my answers to that question. Always two answers. Notice that this one here we used the 0 property. So the 0 property, and then here we used addition property. We added 17 to both sides. And then the division property. So there's always a rule that takes us from one step to another. Here's another one. Something times something equals 0. You do the same thing. I won't do the whole thing, but it'd be 4t plus 1 equals 0, or 3t minus 2 equals 0, and then you'd solve each of those linear equations. Okay, but now let's go to, and notice that all the ones I gave you on this page, they were all factored already. So they were written in a factored form. But we want to be able to get a question like this one where it's not factored and be able to solve it. And that's the trick for solving these, is to factor it. I like to use these sort of steps over here where I make sure I get everything equal to 0. If you have a quadratic equation, make sure everything's equal to 0. Then factor on that left side. Then use your 0 property, and then I should have said after, use any other property that you need in order to solve that equation. So this one here, it's equal to 0, step 1 done. Factor it. Common factor is an x. I can take an x out. I'm left with x take away 1 equals 0. Factoring's done. 0 property says that if I'm multiplying something times something and it gets me 0, then either x is 0 or x minus 1 is 0. One of those two factors must equal 0. So this one's already solved, so 0 is one of my answers. And my other answer, if I add 1 on both sides, I get x is equal to a positive 1. There's my other answer. Two answers to that question. And you could try either one of them. 1 squared is 1, minus 1 is 0. That one checks. 0 squared is 0. 0 minus 0 is also equal to 0. That one checks out too. Let's try a couple more. Same as, oh no, that's not the same because there's a 6 there. Okay, first thing I got to make it equal 0. So I've got to move this 6 over to this side. So I'll subtract 6 on both sides. So it'll be x squared minus x minus 6 is equal to 0. Now I need to factor. Okay, this one's done. I need to factor. This is of the form x squared x and a number, so I think that I can put it into two brackets like that. And notice when you put it into two brackets, that's multiply, I'm setting myself up for the 0 property. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 6, add to a negative 1. I'm thinking 3 and 2, so x minus 3, x plus 2, I think. X squared plus 2x minus 3x would be a minus x. Minus 3 times 2 minus 6. Yeah, that checks out. Okay, so factoring done. Now I use the 0 property. This times this equals 0, so x minus 3 has to be 0, or x plus 2 has to equal 0. So in this case, I get x is equal to 3. In this case, I get x is equal to negative 2 by subtracting 2 on both sides. Again, two answers, solution for that question. Let's plug one back in and see if it works. So 3 squared, if I plug a 3 in, 3 squared is 9, minus, I'm plugging in a 3 again, 9 minus 3 comes out to 6. Yeah, that one's correct. And if you did the negative 2, it would work as well. Maybe I'll do that one too. So I have something squared minus something equals 6. I'm just checking this one. So if I plug in a minus 2 here and a minus 2 there, minus 2 squared is a positive 4, minus a negative that changes to a positive, and sure enough the equals 6. So that one's true as well. Okay, here's another example. I got to make it equal 0, so I'll move the 16 over. 9x squared minus 16 is equal to 0. Now, this one only has two terms. Maybe it's a difference of squares. I can square root this. I can square root that. So, yeah, it's a difference of squares. So, it'll be, split this one up to 3x and 3x. And split 16 into 4 and 4. One's going to be plus, one's going to be minus. If you FOIL all that out, you'll get this. Okay, factoring's done. So now the zero property. This times this equals 0. One of them's got to be 0. So 3x plus 4 is 0, or 3x minus 4 is equal to 0. Take the 4 over and subtract. Divide both sides by 3. I get negative 4/3. Same thing here. Move the 4 over and so I'll add both sides. And then divide both sides by 3. So my answers are negative 4/3 and positive 4/3. Let's try just a couple more maybe. This one here, I have a negative 1. If it's an equation, what I can do with this one is I can multiply every term by a negative and get rid of that negative. So I'm going to multiply this by a negative. That'll be a 2x squared. Multiply this by a negative, it'll be negative 13x. Multiply this by a negative, it'll be positive 21. Multiply 0 by a negative, it'll still be 0. That's just an easy way you can get rid of a negative. But you can only do that when it's an equation. Now I can factor. So I'm going to try maybe the guess and check method. See if that works. It's a 2x squared, so it has to be a 2x and an x. And then factors of 21. So I'm thinking 7 and 3. But 7 here, that's 14. No. How about a 3 there? And a 7 there. This is positive, so they both have to be the same sign. They both have to be negative. So these are both going to be negative. Let's just check that. 2x squared minus 6 minus 7, that's minus 13. Minus 7 times minus 3 is positive 21. Okay, it's factored properly. So it was equal to 0 already. I factored it. Now let's use a 0 property, which says that times that equals 0. One of them 0. So 2x minus 7 is 0, or x minus 3 is 0. So this one will be x equals 3. It's one of my answers. This one, add 7 to both sides, divide both sides by 2, and you get 7 over 2. There's my other answer. One last one. I have to make it equal to 0, so I have to add 10 to both sides. So 2y squared plus 12y plus 10 equals 0. Hey, there 2 will go into each of them. So if I factor a 2 out, it'll be y squared plus 6y plus 5 equals 0. This is the normal one, so I can split that into two numbers that multiply to 5 and add to 6 have to be 5 and 1. So y plus 5, y plus 1 is equal to 0. Now this is and I'm going to use a 0 property, which says if I have something times something times something and it equals 0, in this case I have 3 of them equal 0. 3 factors equal 0. So either 2 is equal to 0, or y plus 5 is equal to 0, or y plus 1 is equal to 0. Well, I know that 2 is not equal to 0, so that's a nonsense kind of one, so that doesn't work. But in this case here, I can subtract 5 on both sides. I can subtract 1 on both sides. So I get two answers. One is a negative 5, and the other one's a negative 1. Okay, so for solving quadratic equations, the big tool to add to your tool chest is this 0 property. That if I have anything times and something else and it comes out to 0, either one of them is 0 or the other one is equal to 0, and that'll give me my two answers. All right, try a bunch of questions.